What if I told you that the Bible you grew up with, the one you thought you knew from Genesis to Revelation, might be missing pieces of the story? Keys about creation, the lives of the patriarchs, and even the laws of God Himself. For centuries, most of the Christian world has turned its pages without ever hearing the name of a book that dares to fill in those gaps. The Book of Jubilees. In the quiet libraries of Ethiopia, where ancient manuscripts rest like sleeping embers of forgotten fire, this book is still read and honored. It calls itself a retelling of Genesis, but it does far more than repeat familiar verses. Jubilees claims to reveal what was hidden, to expose the structure beneath the story, a cosmic design of angels, sacred time, and heavenly laws written before the world began. Yet, there is a problem, a mystery that hangs over its 50 chapters like a shadow. This book, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, was rejected by most of the early church and banned from the canon that shaped Western Christianity. It was not merely ignored, it was pushed to the edges, labeled apocryphal, suspect, dangerous. Why? What did it say that made the gatekeepers of doctrine step back and close the door? Jubilees speaks of angels who govern the movements of the heavens, of a divine calendar that rules the rhythm of creation, of commandments given long before Sinai, whispered to Adam, Noah, and Abraham through heavenly messengers. It insists that time itself was crafted as a sacred architecture and that humanity has largely abandoned that design. It calls itself Little Genesis, as if to say there is another layer beneath the opening chapters of Scripture, a layer that has been sealed away. So the question is not just what is in this book. The question is, why were we never meant to read it? In this video, we will step into that tension. We will open the pages of the forbidden Book of Jubilees, trace its retelling of Genesis, and ask why so many believers through history decided its words were too controversial, too disruptive, or perhaps too revealing to be included in the Bible you hold in your hands today. In most Bibles, the story of creation begins with a simple rhythm. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. Light, sky, land, stars, creatures, and finally, humanity. But the Book of Jubilees insists that something even deeper was happening beneath those days, something most of us were never told. According to Jubilees, when God spoke light into existence, He did not just create space, He created time itself and carved it into a sacred pattern. Every sunrise, every season, every passing year was not random, but woven into a precise design, a divine calendar meant to keep all of creation in step with His will. In this telling, time is not a neutral backdrop. It is a covenant. Jubilees describes a universe where days and years are not simply counted, but consecrated. The book introduces a 364-day year, a perfect sequence divided into 4 seasons of exactly 91 days each. A structure so ordered that Sabbaths and festivals always fall on the same appointed days. No drifting feast days, no shifting holy times. Everything returns, again and again, to its rightful place, like the turning of a great celestial wheel. This, Jubilees says, is sacred time, the way the Creator intended His world to breathe. And this calendar is not merely human. Jubilees tells us that heavenly beings stand watch over it. Angels are appointed to oversee the movements of the sun, the paths of the stars, the turning of the seasons. They guard the boundaries of days and years, the way centuries guard the gates of a city. Time, in this vision, is a temple, and the angels are its priests. To live within this order is to walk in harmony with the Creator's heartbeat. To ignore it is to step out of tune with the music of heaven itself. Reading this, you begin to realize that Jubilees is not just asking, when did God create the world? It is asking, according to whose clock are you living? If time was crafted as a sacred architecture, if every week and season was designed to carry the weight of worship and obedience, then losing that structure is not a minor mistake. It is a spiritual fracture. In Jubilees, the question of calendars is not about math. It is about allegiance. Whether humanity will measure its days by the shifting opinions of empires or by the unchanging rhythm God set in place at the very beginning. Before there was soil to touch, before there was water to drink, before a single human ever drew breath, the Book of Jubilees says something else moved in the newborn light of creation. On the very first day, when God separated light from darkness, He also brought forth beings of pure spirit, angels, created not as decorations in heaven, but as governors, custodians, and witnesses of His eternal order. In most tellings of Genesis, we meet the angels only later, as messengers who appear here and there in the story. But Jubilees pulls back the curtain and places them at the very foundation of everything. They are present when the cosmos is framed. They are assigned their ranks and their duties as the universe itself begins to turn. Some are set over the movements of the heavens, watching the path of the sun as it rises and sets, tracing the arc of the stars as they cross the night. Others stand as guardians of God's law, bearing the commandments that will one day be given to humanity. Still others serve as messengers of the divine presence, carrying words from the throne of God into the world of men. In this vision, nothing in creation is left unattended. The course of the sun is not random, it is ordained. The change of the seasons is not a natural accident, it is supervised. Jubilees pictures the angels as the unseen hands that keep the cosmos from unraveling, making sure that the sun keeps its appointed course, that the boundaries of days, weeks, and years hold firm, that the great clock of creation does not fall out of sync with the will of its maker. But their work does not stop with the sky. These angels, especially those called the angels of the presence, stand as a living bridge between heaven and earth. They carry the knowledge of God's laws, His Sabbaths, His statutes, and they are ready to pass them down to humanity at the appointed time. In Jubilees, the universe is not a silent machine. It is a watched, guarded, and guided order. And here is the warning woven into that picture. When humanity steps out of alignment with the time and order God established, when we ignore the rhythms He set and the laws He revealed, creation itself begins to feel the fracture. Chaos is not just moral, it is cosmic. According to Jubilees, to rebel against God's order is to push against the very framework that angels were placed to protect. For most of us, a calendar is just a tool, numbers on a page, an app on a phone, a way to keep track of meetings and holidays. But in the Book of Jubilees, the calendar is not a convenience, it is a battlefield. Time itself becomes a place of war, a line drawn between those who walk in God's order and those who slowly drift away from it. Jubilees declares something bold, even shocking. The world is counting its days wrong. According to this ancient text, humanity was meant to follow a solar year of 364 days, 4 seasons of exactly 91 days each. A structure so precise that every Sabbath and every festival returns to its proper place, year after year, never wandering, never slipping. It is a perfect grid of weeks and seasons, a sacred architecture of time, where nothing is left to chance. In this system, holy days are anchored. Worship is anchored. Life itself is anchored. But then, Jubilees says, something went wrong. Nations turned their eyes from the sun's steady course and began to chase the changing phases of the moon. The lunar calendar, with its shifting months and sliding feast days, crept in. What looked like a simple change in counting was, in the eyes of Jubilees, a spiritual rebellion. The moon's irregular rhythm caused appointed times to drift, sacred festivals to move, days of testimony to fall on abominable days. The book issues a sober warning. Those who follow the moon will disturb the seasons and corrupt the holy order of God's time. This is not just poetry. Jubilees links this shift in calendars to a deeper disorder in the human heart. If God established a fixed pattern and inscribed it into creation, then changing the calendar is not a neutral adjustment. It is an act of defiance, a quiet decision to live out of sync with the Creator's design. The result is confusion, not only in dates and seasons, but in worship, obedience, and covenant. And yet, even today, echoes of that original solar pattern remain. The Ethiopian calendar, still used by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, bears a striking resemblance to the sacred structure Jubilees describes. Months ordered, an extra span of days added to complete the year. Time treated as something holy, not disposable. It raises a haunting question. Has the world, in chasing its own systems, abandoned a calendar that once reflected the heartbeat of heaven? In the vision of Jubilees, the choice of calendar is more than a matter of culture or tradition. It is a declaration of allegiance. Will we measure our days according to the shifting tides of human systems, or according to the unshakable pattern God claims to have written into the very fabric of creation? In most Bibles, the creation story reaches its quiet peak with a simple line: "On the seventh day, God rested." We imagine a pause, a breath, a divine sigh over a finished universe. But the Book of Jubilees refuses to leave it there. It tells us that on that seventh day, something far greater than rest was born. According to Jubilees, God did not merely stop working, He crowned time itself. He took one day and lifted it above all others, sanctifying the seventh day as an eternal law, a sign stamped into the very structure of creation. The Sabbath in this vision is not just a command for Israel, it is a cosmic principle. Jubilees describes the Sabbath as a day woven into the bones of the universe, a rhythm that heaven itself observes. The angels, it says, keep the Sabbath. They rest in reverence. They worship in harmony with that seventh-day holiness. From the very beginning, the Sabbath was not just for humans stumbling through history. It was for all of God's works, the unseen and the seen, the spiritual and the physical, the hosts of heaven and the dust of the earth. When God blessed the seventh day, He blessed it for all times, marking it as a perpetual sign of His holiness over everything He has made. But Jubilees does not stop at the weekly cycle. It widens the lens and reveals a larger pattern pulsing beneath human history. The Jubilee cycles. Time, the book claims, is arranged in spans of weeks and years that lead up to grand intervals of restoration. 49-year cycles designed to reset the world according to God's justice and mercy. In these Jubilee years, land is released, debts are forgiven, slaves are set free, and creation is allowed to rest. It is as if God built into time a recurring heartbeat of grace, a scheduled return to harmony whenever humanity's greed and oppression push the world toward imbalance. In this light, the Sabbath is not a random rule. It is the foundation of a much larger architecture. Every seventh day whispers of a greater restoration to come. Every cycle of 7 years and every jubilee declares that God has not abandoned His design. Time itself becomes a testimony that He intends rest for the weary, release for the bound, renewal for the land and the people who have been crushed by their own sin and by the weight of a broken world. According to Jubilees, to ignore the Sabbath and the Jubilee cycles is not just to break a religious habit. It is to step out of the pattern God drew into creation, to refuse the rest He commanded and the restoration He promised. The question is no longer, should we rest one day a week? It becomes far more searching. Do we live inside the rhythm of God's redemption? Or are we fighting against the very cycles He ordained to heal His world? In the book of Genesis, Adam appears as the first man, shaped from the dust and filled with the breath of life, placed in a garden to tend and to keep it. But in the Book of Jubilees, his story is wrapped in deeper layers of command, covenant, and heavenly instruction. Adam is not just the first human, he is the first recipient of law. According to Jubilees, when God formed Adam on the 6th day, He did not leave him to wander in innocent ignorance. From the beginning, Adam was entrusted with specific commandments, laws concerning the Sabbath, purity, marriage, and worship, delivered not in vague impressions, but through the ministry of angels. These were not random rules. They were expressions of a heavenly order that existed long before there was soil beneath Adam's feet. Jubilees introduces us to the angels of the presence, those who stand closest to the throne of God. It is through them, the book says, that Adam learns what holiness looks like. They instruct him in how to honor the seventh day, how to distinguish what is clean from what is unclean, how to approach God with sacrifice and reverence, how to walk in covenant faithfulness. In this telling, the law is not a late addition to the story of humanity. It is there from the beginning, descending like light from heaven to shape the very first steps of the very first man. Even the animals, Jubilees suggests, are brought before Adam according to a divinely ordered sequence. Beasts, cattle, birds, creatures of the earth and the waters, all presented in their kinds under the watchful guidance of the angels. Creation is not chaotic. It is arranged, categorized, and entrusted to Adam with purpose. He is called not only to name what God made, but to rule under the pattern God revealed. This changes the way we see the fall. If Adam received laws from heaven, if he knew the holiness of the Sabbath and the purity God required, then his disobedience is not the stumble of a child who does not understand. It is the breaking of a covenant. It is the first fracture in a line of commandments that were meant to bind heaven and earth together. Jubilees presses a provocative question into our hands. What if God's law did not begin at Sinai, but in Eden? What if the commandments we associate with Moses were already echoing in the garden, taught by angels, observed in heaven, and offered to humanity from the very first days of creation? If that is true, then sin is not just breaking a rule. It is stepping out of a harmony that was always meant to include us. A harmony in which heaven and earth keep the same Sabbath, honor the same holiness, and walk by the same eternal word. The garden closes, the sword of flame turns, and humanity steps out into a world that now knows shame, sweat, and distance from God. But even outside Eden, the story does not simply drift. It sharpens, it divides. In Genesis, we are told of two brothers, Cain and Abel. One who offers the fruit of the ground, the other the firstlings of his flock. In the Book of Jubilees, this moment becomes more than a family quarrel. It becomes the first great test of the law that had already been whispered from heaven. Abel's sacrifice, Jubilees suggests, is not accepted by accident. It aligns with the pattern of purity and offering that Adam had been taught by the angels. The best, the first, the blood of the flock presented in faith. Cain's offering, by contrast, is not merely less. It stands outside that divine pattern, an act that carries the weight of a heart already drifting from obedience. When God regards Abel and not Cain, jealousy is only the surface emotion. Underneath it lies rebellion against a standard that did not originate in human culture, but in the heavenly tablets themselves. Then comes the moment that tears the earth. A field, a conversation, a rising hand, and the first human blood crying from the ground. In Jubilees, the murder of Abel is not just a tragedy. It is the first major breach of God's law, a wound cut into the moral fabric of creation. Cain is judged and cast out, his sin recorded, his line marked by wandering. Lawlessness begins to spread like a shadow across the generations. But the story does not end with banishment. Jubilees lifts our eyes to a third son, Seth. Where Genesis mentions him briefly, Jubilees lingers. Seth is not just another child. He is portrayed as the bearer of a righteous line, taught to keep the commandments handed down from Adam, which had come from the angels. In him, the covenant is not erased. It is preserved. Through Seth, knowledge of the Sabbath, sacrifice, and purity continues, like a hidden flame passed from hand to hand while the world grows darker. Here, the book draws a dividing line that will echo through all its pages. There is a line that clings to the heavenly order, and a line that walks away from it. The descendants of Cain build cities, systems, and cultures that ignore the law written in heaven, while the descendants of Seth are called to walk in obedience, even as violence and corruption grow around them. Jubilees wants us to see more than ancient genealogy. It wants us to feel the weight of choice. From the first brothers, humanity is split between those who treat God's commands as holy and those who treat them as optional. The question presses forward through time, from Cain and Abel, from Seth and his sons, all the way to us. Will we join the line of rebellion, or will we quietly, stubbornly stand in the line of those who keep the law written before the world began? By the time the line of Seth had stretched across generations, the world no longer looked like the fresh creation Adam once saw. According to the Book of Jubilees, the earth did not simply become wicked in a vague sense. It became a place where the very order of creation was twisted, where heaven's rebels walked among men, and where life itself began to eat itself alive. Genesis briefly whispers of the Nephilim, those mysterious giants born from the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Jubilees takes that whisper and turns it into a chilling roar. It tells us that fallen angels descended and took human wives, and from this unholy union came beings of great strength and terrible appetite. These giants did not merely live on the earth. They corrupted it. They brought forbidden knowledge, stirred violence, and dragged humanity further from the laws written on the heavenly tablets. The book describes a world where all flesh corrupted its way. Men, cattle, beasts, birds, every creature turning from its God-given order. What began as disobedience becomes something monstrous. The creatures of the earth begin to devour one another. Violence is no longer the exception, it is the atmosphere. The law once taught by angels is drowned out by the sound of crushing bones and the cries of the oppressed. The earth itself, Jubilees suggests, groans under the weight of this corruption. Into this chaos stands one man, Noah. In Genesis, he is righteous in his generation. In Jubilees, that righteousness is anchored in something specific. Noah walks in the laws that had been handed down from Adam through Seth, preserved despite the darkness. He honors purity, he keeps the Sabbath, he knows the pattern of sacrifice. While the world tears itself apart, Noah clings to the order heaven revealed long ago. God's response, as Jubilees tells it, is both terrifying and merciful. The flood is not just a reset button. It is a judgment on a creation that has violently rejected its design. Waters rise, foundations break, and the giants, the corrupted flesh, the lawless cultures are swept away. But in the ark, carried above the chaos, is a remnant, a family, a covenant, and the memory of heavenly law. After the flood, God does more than promise never again to destroy the earth with water. Jubilees says he renews and expands his covenant with Noah. He instructs him in laws of sacrifice and purity, reiterates the holiness of the Sabbath, and binds Noah's descendants to a standard that did not begin with Moses and will not end with Israel. The altar Noah builds is more than an act of gratitude. It is a declaration that the world's new beginning will either stand or fall on its willingness to walk in God's order. In the vision of Jubilees, the story of Noah is not just about survival. It is about preservation of a law, a rhythm, and a covenant that heaven refuses to let the earth forget, no matter how many times humanity chooses to drown itself in its own violence. By the time the waters of Noah's flood had long dried and empires began to rise out of the dust, the world once again drifted toward darkness. Cities filled with altars, but not to the living God. Statues stood in marketplaces, carved from stone and wood, painted with gold and silver, but they could not see, could not hear, could not speak. Into this world, the Book of Jubilees tells us, a child was born in a house full of idols. A child whose obedience would shake the foundations of nations. His name was Abraham. Genesis introduces Abraham when God calls him to leave his homeland. But Jubilees pulls us further back, into his youth, into the very rooms where his father Terah kept his gods. The book paints a vivid scene. Shelves lined with images of stone, clay, and metal. Figures worshipped by the family and the city around them. As a boy, Abraham watches the incense rise to lifeless faces. He hears prayers whispered to objects that never answer. Something in him trembles, not with fear, but with holy dissatisfaction. One day, Jubilees says, Abraham dares to ask the question no one else will voice. "My father, what is this idol you worship?" He steps closer, studying the carved image, realizing it is nothing more than stone. And then he does the unthinkable. Abraham does not simply doubt the idols, he destroys them. He takes the figures his father bows before and burns them, shattering the illusion of their power in front of all who see. Then he flees into the wilderness, choosing exile over compromise, loneliness over a life built on lies. In that act of fire, Jubilees shows us a deeper truth. Abraham does not begin as a comfortable believer. He begins as a rebel against false gods. His story is not just about leaving his country. It is about breaking with a spiritual system that had wrapped itself around his family and his culture. While the world bows to what it has carved, Abraham turns his back and lifts his eyes to the unseen Creator. But Jubilees goes even further. It tells us that Abraham did not only reject idols, he embraced laws that many think began much later. Long before Moses, before Sinai, before tablets of stone were lifted before a trembling nation, Abraham is depicted as keeping the Sabbath, offering sacrifices according to divine instruction, and following purity laws reviewed through angels. He is not wandering in vague faith. He is walking in a pattern, guided by commandments written on the heavenly tablets and taught to him by messengers of God. In this light, Abraham becomes more than the father of a nation. He is a bridge between the ancient law given to Adam and Noah and the people who would one day stand at Sinai. His life shouts a message that echoes through Jubilees. True faith does not merely leave idols behind. It steps into a life shaped by the eternal laws that heaven has held from the very beginning. By the time Abraham had walked many miles with God, his story was no longer just about leaving one land for another. It had become a living covenant, written not only in promises, but in flesh. In Genesis, we are told that God commanded Abraham to circumcise himself and every male in his household as a sign of the covenant. The Book of Jubilees pulls that moment up into the heavens and shows us what was happening behind the veil. According to Jubilees, circumcision was not a new idea introduced in Abraham's day. It was an ancient law, already inscribed on the heavenly tablets, the eternal record of God's decrees, written before the foundations of the world. When God called Abraham to circumcise himself and his sons, he was not inventing a symbol. He was inviting Abraham to step into a law that had always existed, a mark that aligned his body and his descendants with a cosmic ordinance. The cutting of the flesh was not just about belonging to a nation. It was about syncing a bloodline with a pattern heaven had carried from the beginning. Jubilees describes this covenant as everlasting, a law for all generations, not to be moved, not to be delayed, not to be treated lightly. To refuse it was not simply to disobey a command. It was to step out of an eternal rhythm, to reject an inscription already written in the very blueprint of creation. In Abraham's obedience, the book sees more than a single act. It sees a man agreeing with something the angels already know, a mortal life bending to a law that governs both heaven and earth. Then the story moves to a mountain whose name we still whisper with trembling. Moriah. Genesis tells us that God tested Abraham by asking him to offer his son Isaac. Jubilees opens the scene further. It tells us that an adversary, Mastema, a prince of evil often associated with Satan, stood before God and proposed the test, hoping Abraham would fail, hoping the covenant would crack. The binding of Isaac is no longer just a father and a knife and an altar. It is a battlefield in the unseen realm, a moment when the forces of darkness strain to break the faith of the man through whom God plans to bless the world. As Abraham climbs the mountain, wood on his son's back, fire in his hand, the air is thick with more than human emotion. Jubilees says angels are watching. One stands ready with a message from God. At the last moment, as Abraham stretches out his hand, heaven intervenes. A voice calls, a command is given. Do not lay your hand on the boy. The test is complete. Abraham's fear of God, his willingness to surrender even the promise itself, has shattered the accusation of Mastema. In this telling, the altar on Moriah is not just a place of personal obedience. It is a declaration to every realm, seen and unseen, that covenant faithfulness is stronger than temptation, that the man marked with an eternal sign will not be turned aside, and that God Himself will provide the sacrifice that history is still waiting to fully understand. Before Jacob and Esau ever took their first breath, before their tiny hands ever grasped at the air, a conflict was already written over their lives. In Genesis, we hear God tell Rebekah, "Two nations are in your womb." In the Book of Jubilees, that sentence becomes a thunderclap that echoes across history. This is not just a family tension, it is a cosmic struggle. It is the dividing line between a people who will cling to God's covenant and a people who will war against it. Jubilees slows the moment down. It shows Rebekah troubled, feeling the turmoil inside her body as the twins struggle and clash within her. She seeks the Lord, and He reveals more than maternal discomfort. He unveils destiny. The older will serve the younger. Jacob is chosen to inherit the blessing, to carry the line of righteousness that began with Abraham. Esau, though born first, is shown as one whose heart will lean toward rebellion, whose descendants will rise in opposition to Israel. This is not favoritism. It is foreknowledge. It is the heavenly tablets speaking before the boys can even speak their own names. As the brothers grow, the differences that were written in prophecy begin to show in their choices. Esau is drawn to the fields, the hunt, the immediate satisfaction of appetite. Jacob lingers in tents, closer to the promises, closer to the story his fathers told. In Genesis, Jacob's gaining of the birthright and blessing looks tangled in deception and human weakness. Jubilees does not ignore that tension, but it frames it inside a larger design. Jacob, it insists, was always meant to carry the covenant. What looks like trickery on the surface is folded into a purpose that was declared before either brother was born. Then the story stretches beyond the tent and the stolen blessing. Jubilees traces Esau's line as it grows into a nation, Edom, a people who will not simply live beside Israel, but stand against them. Their hostility is not a random political rivalry. It is the outward expression of an inward posture that began in their forefathers' heart. Esau's descendants, the book says, will oppress Jacob's descendants, seeking to break what God has chosen to build. In this light, the conflict between Jacob and Esau becomes more than ancient drama. It becomes a mirror of the ongoing war between righteousness and rebellion, between those who submit to the law written in heaven and those who rage against it. Jubilees wants us to see that from the very beginning, God knew which line would guard His covenant and which line would resist it. And as history marches on, every nation, every heart must decide which brother's path it will follow. By the time Jacob's household had grown into a crowded camp of wives, children, servants, and flocks, something larger than a family was forming. In Genesis, his 12 sons are simply the branches of a complex family tree. In the Book of Jubilees, they are more than that. They are foundations, living stones being set in place for the house of Israel. Each birth aligned not only with human passion, but with a timetable written in heaven. Jubilees tells us that the births of Jacob's sons were not random, not accidental, not merely the result of rivalry between Leah and Rachel. Each son, it says, was born according to the time set by the Lord, their names and destinies inscribed on the heavenly tablets. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. 12 lives arriving in a sequence that matched the sacred calendar, as if heaven itself were turning pages in a book only God could read. The forming of the tribes is framed as a deliberate act, a slow unveiling of a nation that would one day carry the law and the presence of the Most High. But even in this divinely ordered family, sin does not sleep. Genesis records a brief, shocking line. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, goes up to his father's concubine. Jubilees lingers over the moment and shows its spiritual weight. Reuben's act is not treated as a passing scandal. It is a violation of the divine laws that had been in place since the days of Adam. It is a breach of purity, an offense not only against his father, but against the holy order that God had established. Because of this, Jubilees tells us, Reuben is disqualified. His birthright is stripped away. The honor of leading the tribes does not remain with the oldest. Instead, the line of rulership is shifted. Judah, the fourth son, is chosen as prince over his brothers, the one through whom kingship will eventually flow. And another son, Levi, is set apart for a different kind of greatness. Levi, in Jubilees, is not simply the ancestor of priests by historical accident. He is chosen by eternal decree. His tribe is marked on the heavenly tablets for the priesthood forever. Appointed to offer sacrifices, to stand between the people and God, to guard the law and teach it to Israel. The priesthood is not invented at Sinai. It is revealed there. Its roots, Jubilees insists, reach back into decisions God made long before a single sacrifice burned on an earthly altar. In this telling, the fall of Reuben, the rise of Judah, and the setting apart of Levi form a single revelation. God's purposes are not chained to human order. Firstborn status can be lost, hidden sons can be exalted, and the roles of leadership and priesthood are not trophies of birth, but gifts of a God who writes destinies in heaven and then walks them out on earth. When we think of the 12 tribes of Israel, we often picture a map, territories divided, borders drawn, pieces of land assigned to each son of Jacob. But in the Book of Jubilees, the inheritance of Israel is measured in something far greater than soil. Land is part of their calling, but it is not the heart of it. According to Jubilees, the 12 tribes are not just heirs of a promised country, they are guardians of a promised law. The book says that when God spoke to Jacob about his sons, he did more than bless their future. He placed responsibility on their shoulders. These are the laws for your sons and their descendants forever, Jubilees echoes, written on the heavenly tablets, that they may walk in them and live. In this vision, every tribe is entrusted with a share of holy duty. They are not merely clans with banners, they are stewards of commandments that existed before they did, laws that angels themselves observe in heaven. Imagine it. 12 tribes spread across the land, but bound together by the same invisible code. Sabbaths, festivals, purity laws, sacrifices, justice for the poor, mercy for the oppressed. Each tribe, from Judah to Dan, from Levi to Benjamin, is called to reflect a piece of God's character, to live out on earth what is already written in heaven. The promised land is not just a gift to enjoy. It is a stage on which they are meant to act out the will of the Most High. In Jubilees, this turns Israel into something more than a nation among nations. They become a living covenant. When they keep the law, they are not just obeying rules. They are aligning their lives with the pattern inscribed on the heavenly tablets. Their obedience becomes a testimony to the world that there is one God, one order, one way of life that leads to blessing. When they break that law, they are not just failing morally, they are stepping out of the role they were created to fill, letting go of the stewardship for which they were chosen. The 12 tribes then stand before us not only as ancient names, but as a picture of what God desires from His people in every age. Not passive recipients of blessing, but active keepers of His word, men and women who understand that to belong to God is to carry His law, not only in their lands, but in their minds, their decisions, and the very rhythm of their days. Part 14. By the time Joseph walked the fields of Canaan in his multicolored coat, the story of Israel was already heavy with promises. Dreams of sheaves bowing, stars and planets bending low, flickered in his sleep like prophetic fire. In Genesis, his brother's jealousy looks painfully human, resentment toward the favored son. But in the Book of Jubilees, their hatred carries a darker weight. Their decision is not just a crime against a brother, it is a transgression against a plan already written in heaven. Jubilees tells us that when the sons of Jacob sold Joseph into slavery, their sin was recorded on the heavenly tablets. It is inscribed there not as a small matter, but as a great offense against the eternal law. Their hands take silver, their mouths form lies, and in that moment, the future of their descendants is marked. The book declares that the suffering Israel will later endure in Egypt is tied, in part, to this very betrayal. Their children will taste bondage because their fathers tore the covenant family from within. Sin in Jubilees does not stay local. It ripples forward through generations. Yet even as Joseph is dragged away in chains, another story is unfolding. A story of preservation and purpose. Jubilees reveals that Joseph's path to Egypt was not an accident of cruelty, but a journey already written on the heavenly tablets. Angels, it says, were sent to guard him, to keep him from perishing, because his life was precious in the eyes of the Lord. In prison cells, in foreign courts, in moments when everything seemed lost, the unseen hands of heaven were at work, guiding him toward the place where his dreams would become reality. When Joseph rises to power in Egypt, interpreting Pharaoh's dream, storing grain, and saving nations from famine, Jubilees insists this is not the triumph of mere talent, it is destiny. It was written that he would rule, that through him the sons of Israel would be preserved and bound. His wisdom feeds them, but his position also brings them into the land where they will one day be enslaved. The same path that saves them from starvation leads them toward shackles and whips, toward an exodus that has already been scheduled on God's eternal calendar. Before Joseph dies, Jubilees portrays him as a prophet of that future. He tells his brothers that God will visit them, that he will bring them out of Egypt to the land sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that these things are written and sealed on the heavenly tablets. His bones rest in foreign soil, but his words point forward to a day when the God who wrote Joseph's story will write a new chapter for all of Israel. Through plagues, through parted seas, through a deliverance planned long before a single brother dipped a coat in blood. By the time Joseph's name had faded from Egyptian memory, his family was no longer a small clan. They had become a people, multiplied, settled, growing strong in a land that was not their own. Then a new king arose, one who did not know Joseph, and what began as favor hardened into fear. In Genesis and Exodus, we see a political shift. Pharaoh enslaves Israel, sets taskmasters over them, and turns a nation of guests into a nation of slaves. But in the Book of Jubilees, something else is happening beneath the lash and the brick. A spiritual war is unfolding. Jubilees tells us that Israel's bondage in Egypt was not a surprise, nor a mere twist of human power. It had been foretold, written on the heavenly tablets long before a single Hebrew baby cried in Goshen. Their oppression, their tears, their groans beneath the weight of forced labor, all of it sat inside a larger plan. God himself had ordained that they would be oppressed for a time so that his power, when revealed, would shake not only a palace, but the nations. Their suffering would become the stage on which His name would be glorified. But the book also reveals another figure moving in the shadows. Mastema, the prince of the evil spirits, a dark counterpart standing against God's purposes. Jubilees describes how Mastema and his hosts stirred Pharaoh's heart, pushing him to harden his grip, to increase the cruelty, to crush Israel's faith. The chains on Israel's wrists, in this vision, are not only forged in royal courts, they are hammered in the fires of spiritual hatred. The goal is not only to break their bodies, but to make them forsake their covenant, to sever them from the law written in heaven. When God begins to act, sending Moses back into the land he fled, the plagues that follow are more than plagues. In Exodus, they are signs and wonders. In Jubilees, they are targeted strikes in a cosmic war. Each blow, the blood, the darkness, the hail, the death of the firstborn, is aimed not only at Pharaoh, but at the gods of Egypt and the unseen powers behind them. The Nile is exposed as powerless. The sun is shown to be a servant, not a deity. The firstborn, once symbols of strength, fall under the judgment of the one who truly gives life. Heaven is dismantling Egypt's spiritual system piece by piece. And all of it, Jubilees insists, happens on schedule. The timing of the Exodus is not improvised. It is fixed on the heavenly tablets. The 14th day of the first month, an appointed time set apart from the beginning of creation. On that night, under a sky marked long ago, the blood on Israel's doorposts becomes a sign, not just to the destroyer, but to all of history, that God keeps time by His own calendar. He delivers when He has decreed, and no pharaoh, no mastema, no empire can delay a liberation that heaven has already inscribed. When most people think of the law of Moses, they picture Sinai, a mountain wrapped in smoke, thunder rolling, a trembling nation below as God carves commandments onto stone. But in the Book of Jubilees, Sinai is not the beginning of the law, it is the unveiling. Long before Moses climbed that mountain, Jubilees says the law was already written, inscribed on the heavenly tablets, crafted before the foundation of the world as a blueprint for how heaven and earth were meant to live. Moses does not invent a covenant. He receives what has always been there. In this telling, the commandments are not temporary regulations for a single nation. They are eternal, binding for all generations, echoing through angels and humans alike. Jubilees insists that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, even Noah and Adam kept these laws in their own days. Sabbaths, sacrifices, purity, the rhythm of sacred time, taught by angels, observed in heaven, practiced on earth. Sinai becomes the moment when what was hidden is made public, when a law already active in the unseen realm is handed at last into human hands in its complete form. At the heart of this law stands the cosmic calendar, the Sabbaths, the festivals, the Jubilee years. Jubilees insists they are not cultural customs, but pieces of a divine rhythm. Time itself is part of the covenant. To keep the appointed days according to the 364-day year is to walk in step with the pattern God fixed from creation. To deviate is to slide into confusion and spiritual error. In this vision, obedience is not only about what you do, it is about when you do it, about aligning your life with a schedule written in heaven. From there, the book lifts our eyes to the long road of Israel's history. Their rebellion, their exile, their suffering among the nations, their eventual return. It is all, Jubilee says, already written on the heavenly tablets. Nothing surprises God. The times of their discipline and the times of their deliverance are fixed. Angels are appointed not only to guard, but to judge. They will one day separate the righteous from the wicked, gathering those who kept the covenant and executing justice on those who despised it. Mastema, the dark prince who opposed God's people from the days of Abraham and Egypt, will be bound and finally cast into the abyss, no longer able to accuse, deceive, or destroy. Then comes the culmination, the vision that stretches beyond history into eternity. Jubilees speaks of a day when Israel will turn back to the Lord with all their heart, when He will gather them from the nations and restore them to their land, when the law will be re-established not merely on stone, but written on their hearts. A messianic kingdom rises in this picture, where God's chosen ruler reigns in righteousness, where the righteous share His rule, and the law becomes the joy of a renewed creation. The wicked are cast into the lake of fire. Evil is finally silenced, and the cosmic order that was fractured in Eden is fully restored. In the end, the Book of Jubilees does more than retell Genesis and Exodus. It threads every story, from creation to patriarchs, from Egypt to exile, from angels to end times, into a single claim: that history is not random, that law is not human invention, and that God's plan has always moved toward one goal: a world where His time, His law, and His kingdom stand unchallenged, and where those who chose His way shine forever in the light of His eternal glory.